I'm Colin Sykes. I'm the Environment and Transport Correspondent working for BBC North West tonight. I think we'll all agree there's general consensus from most bodies that climate change is now a reality. Earlier this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded it's beyond doubt that the climate is warming, and more than 90% likely that human activities have driven most of the recent change. There's now all-party agreement in Westminster for the UK to cut CO2 emissions by at least 60%. And that concern is expressed in recent opinion polls, where a majority of people in Britain now say they're concerned about the environment and climate change. And flying is right up there amongst our concerns, amongst everybody speaking tonight, although many people simply want to or need to fly and travel by air. So that's the background for our debate tonight. I'm going to introduce our speakers one by one, as I said. They'll have a few minutes to outline their arguments. Then I'm going to stimulate a debate amongst the panel, and then, time willing, it's over to you at the end to put some questions either via me or through your own contribution to the panel.
Okay, I've got 4 minutes, I believe, without hesitation, repetition or deviation. Those Radio 4 listeners amongst you. Right. I'm going to start by stating my position, that I don't care whether you fly or not, to be honest. I'm ambivalent about flying. My concern is climate change, and the work that we do in the Tyndall Centre clearly demonstrates that we need, and others have done of course, that we need urgent and radical reductions in our carbon dioxide emissions. Work we've done at Tyndall Centre has demonstrated fairly clearly what the UK's fair contribution is to maintaining climate change at a level that we think is relatively safe, to avoid dangerous climate change. So what does this emission pathway, this level of emissions year on year out into the future actually look like? Don't worry too much about the numbers, it's the shape that matters. Up here we have carbon, and along the bottom we have years from 2000 out to 2050. Now we know what's happened so far. These are emissions that we've had so far, government figures back that up. And we can make some sort of estimate as to what's likely to happen in the next few years. Once we've got that, we can calculate what we need to do, what that emission pathway looks like. And there you have the emission pathway in the dark black line. So that's the pathway we need to follow. You can see the annual reductions year on year out to 2030 to 2050. So how does aviation fit into that pathway? That's the fair pathway for the UK to contribute to avoiding dangerous climate change. Well, here's some aviation trends for you. As you can see, they've sort of got a fairly upward flavour to them. The mean annual growth, both in passenger numbers and indeed actually in carbon dioxide emissions, has historically been something like 7% per annum, which is not far off 3 times the rate of growth in the economy. September 11th obviously had a bit of a dip affected aviation and of course the rest of the economy, but since then we're back to the old trends. So aviation is growing very rapidly indeed, as it is of course within the EU. And let's look at this graphically. Back to that graph before, let's plot aviation on the bottom of this. Aviation currently emits about 11 or so million tonnes of carbon, which is about 7% now of UK's total emissions and represents about over half of that from cars. So it's quite a large sector within the UK. If aviation carries on growing at historical rates and then reduces from 2012 onwards, let's imagine some significant policies in place by then, we know by 2012 aviation emissions are likely to be somewhere near 17 million tonnes of carbon, in other words about that from all of cars in the UK. By 2030, it's about 28 million tonnes of carbon. This is quite an optimistic future here in terms of managing to reduce the growth rate. That's about 70% of the total budget for the UK taken up by aviation in this quite optimistic scenario. If, however, aviation carries on with its historical trends, it'll be about 56 million tonnes, 50 to 60 million tonnes, well above the total amount of carbon dioxide for the UK. So what does that mean for us as individuals? Well, let's have a look at the citizens' emissions. We emit about 4.6 tonnes of carbon per person per year from our household activities and from our travel. By 2020, that will have to bring down to about 3 tonnes per year, and by 2030, about 1.4 tonnes. So very radical reductions by 2030, about 70% reduction. Let's compare those numbers with the emissions from typical flights today, and also that's 2020 and 2030. Well, let's look at today. The allowance is 4.5 tonnes per person. Typical flights, Barcelona, about half a tonne. To Washington, about 2, and to Sydney, about 4 tonnes. So you start to see it's a very large chunk of our allowance even today. Now let's imagine that aviation really becomes very efficient. We really have the best planes out there, very good operational practices, no more stacking, no more queuing. What is the future going to look like then? 2020 we have 3 tonnes of carbon per person. Flights are now more efficient, about 0.3 of a tonne for Barcelona, 1.4 for Washington, and about 2.8 for Sydney. Let's do the analysis out to 2030. We find that our emissions are right down now at 1.4 tonnes per person. Barcelona emissions are much lower now, only about 1/4 of a tonne per passenger. Washington about 1 tonne, Sydney about 2 tonnes. But you still see one flight to Sydney exceeds our total allowance for the whole year. So even if we have really very large and significant improvements in aircraft efficiency, all of our home and travel consumption of carbon will be taken up by the aviation sector by 2020, 2030. Indeed, if you look at it today, it already is roughly the same as all these other sectors. So one UK to Australia return flight or two UK to US flights will absorb all of your carbon allowance by 2020 or 2030. So if you're genuinely concerned about climate change and about your children's future, we face some really very stark and uncomfortable choices. And I'm not saying what those choices should be, but to put it as an example here, if you choose to fly to Australia, then you'll have no petrol in your car and you'll have no gas or electricity produced from coal or gas for your house. So these are very stark choices, and you can make those choices. As I say, I'm ambivalent as to whether you fly or not, as long as you keep your carbon dioxide emissions within that budget.